So we were talking about Genesis, and you said it was great to get through one book of the Bible. It's interesting, the author of Tactics, he also has another saying that he says a lot of times. I really like it. He says, never read a Bible verse. And so what he intends by that is most of the time what we do is we read isolated texts that are separated, sometimes even from the chapter they're in or the whole book they're in, and so we lose a lot. And I think it's very beneficial to read through entire books. And one thing that I did for quite a while in my early Christian walk is that I would pick usually a smaller book, but what I would do is I would read like Philippians once a day for 30 days. And so you really get into that letter. It only takes about 15, 20 minutes, but you can digest it, you ask questions, you kind of work with it. When you get into larger books that say have, 20 or 30 chapters, then, you try to read it once a week. And so you could do that, and it really ingrains it, but it helps you. And I agree. Now, did you see anything when it came to Genesis, similarities between Genesis 1 and John 1?
In the beginning.
Yeah. So it refers us back to the beginning in both reference. So when we think of that as creator, we think of Christ as creator, as the originator. So I love that connection between the two. So any other things? There's a lot in the beginning of John. It does. It does. John is probably one of the last Gospels written. There's actually a scholar, John A.T. Robinson, and he was part of the Death of God movement, even though he is an Anglican priest. He wrote a book called Redating the New Testament. And this is quite some time ago. But he makes very convincing arguments, and he is not what we would consider a Bible-thumping Christian. He made arguments that all of the New Testament books are prior to 70 AD. And I agree with him. Now, there's some things when it comes to Revelation, but I do believe that John was probably the last book written. There's some interesting reasons why. One, a lot of it is material that is not contained in the synoptics. So it's almost like he's filling in blanks or areas, or he has a different idea than what the other three gospel writers have. We also have some other indications. A lot of the ones in Mark and Luke that are unnamed, or even Matthew that are unnamed, John starts naming them. So some of the supposition behind that is these people were not named in earlier accounts with Matthew or Mark or Luke because of the possibility of repercussions, because they could be harmed. And by this time, many of the people are no longer there. Now, John is much more directed. I think they're obviously all directed. They have a purpose in mind. A lot of people will say John's is the most theological. Some will say it's only theology and that it's concocted later. But if you look at all the Gospels, Jesus is claiming to be God in all of them. There's obviously theological content. But John is a very powerful. It's one of my favorites. Some of my favorite passages in Scripture come from his discourse, the night of the Last Supper, so John 13 through 17. Just powerful stuff. So we will go entirely through John. So it'll be another book. So all the books that we do, if I'm thinking of my syllabus correctly, we will jump around a little bit, but we will read entire books. I think all of the books that we endeavor to read are entire books. All right, so we will jump into I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And so we'll hit a couple of points at the beginning. I really do like the quote. Okay, we'll get to the quote in just a sec. Let's just revisit where we are with our 12 steps. The reason I kind of pound this over and over again is because it is truly a logical sequenced argument. And so again, as we go through this, you may interact as we use the Columbo tactic, as we're learning with tactics, we can go through and as we start asking questions, we can actually see where this individual is along the spectrum. Are they total skeptics? They believe that truth can't be known. Do they believe in a theistic God and they just need to be convinced of the Christian God? So you can And this is part of the ambassador model, where with knowledge, we know basically where they stand. We can, as the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip, you can start where they need to begin. And so I'll reiterate these 12 steps throughout just so that you remember, this person, believes that truth can be known. He's a scientist, but he doesn't believe there's any proof for the existence of God. Boom. All the information that we learned starting in chapter 3, 4, and 5, we can use. Okay? So it gives you reference as well. So the first thing we learned, truth about reality is knowable, and it's actually undeniable. To deny it is a claim to knowledge, so it's self-defeating. So it's necessarily false. Okay? Then we go, the opposite of true is false. This is just the law of non-contradiction. It is built into the fabric of the universe. Okay? So if we can get them to the point that they know we can claim things to be true, and if the opposite of true is false, then we can show that certain things are wrong. Certain things are right. Okay? Very simple, but it's one of the most denied things nowadays. Okay? Then we go to 3, and this is the argument that we're in right now. It is true that the theistic God exists. Okay? So we're not getting really into Christianity per se yet. And again, a lot of the arguments that we're getting in 3, 4, 5, and 6, and even the prior ones with philosophical arguments, these are not biblical-based arguments. Now, the Bible is compatible with it. Everything the Bible says is compatible, but we're not using the Bible as our source for the knowledge. We're using what we would call general revelation, or the wisdom and, the gifts of thinking that God has given us. But these are some of the arguments. First, we had the cosmological argument. We also talked about the Kalam cosmological argument. So we start with the beginning of the universe. Why is there something rather than nothing? Then we go to the design of the universe. This is what is called the teleological argument, the telos, which basically means the end or the design. Okay, and we talked about the anthropic principle. Quickly again, this is the universe seems to be designed for creatures like us that have a desire to discover. Okay, so multiple things. First, to live and to explore. Okay, then we get into the origin of life, which we really talked about with the mystery of life's origins. That was primarily chapter 5. Okay, and then we are going to go on to it again tonight. But then we'll finish this off with the moral argument. Now, the week that we missed, and maybe I can give it at another time, I give a talk based on a talk by a guy by the name of Alvin Plantinga. And he did a presentation one time that said 24 or so reasons for the existence of God, or proofs for the existence of God. And so it's based on that lecture. And so we'll actually touch base on many other arguments. Here, we're basically just touching on a couple of the ones that are out there. Okay? Some of the other ones can be more abstract, more obtuse, difficult to understand. But what we can see is that it's not a one-way approach to trying to show that this universe is a God-inhabited universe and a God-created universe. We have multiple ways, some more complicated than others and some easier to grasp than others. So we learned all of these, okay? We're in the middle of the argument, and really right now we are working on the design of life again. Because today we're going to talk about after the point that first life appeared. Okay? Remember chapter 5 said they can't even get on the playing field. They can't even start because everything that would come from non-life to life, we've never seen it happen. It's never been shown to occur. We actually have laws of biology that state that life only comes from life. So, but now we're going to give them the benefit. We're going to say, okay, we'll give you that life started somehow. Evolution still doesn't work. So even if we give them some of their premises, which we don't want to, but even if for sake of the advocates say, okay, I'll give you that part, but you still can't get from that self-replicating system to the complexity and the diversity of life that we have around us. Remember that they have to come up with the uniformity of life as well as the dissimilarity of life. A lot of times you'll hear in classes about structures that are the same or that we all have the same DNA. Yes, there are similarities in life, but there's also differences that have to be explained. We look at the peacock. We look at the world all around us. We think about different organisms in the vastly, vastly different ways they live. We think about, those smoker bacteria that are down there in the bottom of the ocean that live in anaerobic conditions or without oxygen. I mean, we just have such a diversity of life. It is amazing. Okay, so that's where we're going to go. So chapter 6 is where we are, and you've probably heard the expression from the goo to you via the zoo. There's many ways of putting this, but that's one of those. New life forms, and I love this. It says in grammar school, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fairy tale. In the university, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fact. Sometimes those very, statements that kind of show analogy or they're easy to remember, and they really do make a point, okay? Because it's something that we have from our experience. We think of the princess and the frog. We think of the ludicrousness, and we think that this is a fairy tale, things within the fairy tale. But yet, when you break it down, eventually, it does. That frog will evolve or whatever. Obviously, it wasn't a frog in their theory, okay? But I think it's just fascinating. So one of the things that I like about the chapter, again, what did he use in the last chapter to bring out the points, or 2 chapters ago, to bring out the points of the anthropic principle? What event in human history did he use? Remember the successful failure? Apollo 13. So what he did is he used something that we could relate to explain that the universe is like that ship was and how precarious life is. They do the same thing here with the information part. Now, has anybody read the book Contact by Carl Sagan? I have, but has anybody else? No? Fascinating book. Jodie Foster then played in the movie that came out, and it's basically SETI. Are you guys familiar with SETI? SETI is it started out as a government project. It's now privately funded. It started in the 60s, I believe. Carl Sagan was one of the founders of it, but it stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So it's actually these huge, and you can see from the picture on the video, that they have these radio telescopes and different type of telescopes that are trying to see if we can hear in the noise of the universe an intelligent signal that would specify intelligence. Okay? Now, it's interesting, if you've read the book or watched the movie, do you guys remember, and it even says in the book, what was the message that first convinced them that there was intelligent life out there? Does anybody remember? The radio signal, and what was it?
Sequence of numbers.
The sequence of prime numbers. Okay, prime meaning those that are divisible only by 1 in themselves. And so it was a list of prime numbers. And so immediately they're like, oh. And I thought it was very interesting. One of the questions that I thought it'd be interesting to talk about is that they make the fact, he quips off and he says, well, why didn't they speak in English? He said, because math is the universal language. And even all languages can be broken down or represented in numeric composition. Think of it this way. Have you guys ever heard of Gematria? We've talked about it maybe in another class. Gematria was an ancient practice because both in Hebrew and Greek, and I know especially in Greek, I'm not as sure about Hebrew, all the letters were also numbers. So alpha was also a number. Beta, those were numbers. And so you could actually calculate the sum, if you want to call it, of somebody's name. That's what we have in Revelation. And it's the mark of a man, his number is 666. It's interesting, there is one variant in that has, one of the translations says it's 616, but that's for another time and another place. But you could calculate based on this. So even when we look at languages like ancient Greece or Greek and Hebrew, you have that equivalent already. So if math is truly a language, which I think it is, okay, we actually have a one-to-one relationship. We're no longer using analogies or we're actually saying DNA is equivalent to language. It's not analogous to language. And you never want to prove something by analogy. You usually use it as an example, you use it to help illustrate. But in this case, we're not using an analogy. They're directly equivalent. So when we say DNA is a code, it is a language, we don't have to say, well, it's kind of like a language. It is a language. It has specified information. And we know that information only comes from one source: intelligence. It is the only known source of code. That's it. We've experienced none other. We've seen none other. I don't even think we can comprehend of none other. Now, we won't get into all the details of specified complexity, but he goes into it in your book, and there's other things I can give you as well. But he goes on, he says, alphabets, and thus language itself, can be ultimately reduced to numbers. This is why the English alphabet is mathematically identical to the genetic alphabet of DNA, and why the comparison of cell information to encyclopedias is a one-to-one relationship rather than just an analogy. Many people will try to say, oh yeah, but you're talking language, you're talking communications, you're talking, written language. Yeah, that's what DNA is. It's a direct equivalent to a written language. Then, a lot of the times their objections to it being an analogy are taken away. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that, because I think it's a very valuable point, because then we can back out into that conversation and say, who would expect? You're expecting me, if they are directly equivalent, to say that this book or that encyclopedia set was written by no one. It's ludicrous. But they can get out of it by saying, well, that's just an analogy. No, that's not an analogy. That's a direct equivalent. Okay? So ponder that. Think about that. You can always let me know if you have further questions. Did you have a question, Kathy?
Just understanding that the English alphabet is mathematically
Yes.
identical.
It's one-to-one ratio. It's just different quantity.
You mean like A is equal to 1?
No. What he's basically saying is each is symbolic for a letter that can compose a language.
Okay.
Even though there's 4 in the alphabet of DNA, there's 26 in the English.
Okay.
So it's not saying quantitatively they're the same. Qualitatively, they're the same. Okay? And one last thing on that is they're finding out with epigenetics, they deal with what are called tags. They think there may be equivalent of about 100 tags, or the epigenetic alphabet, you could say, is 100 letters in the language it composes. It gets mind-numbing. It really does. So, but it's interesting, get this. They're actually giving us a real good argument for design. They are saying that design by intelligence can be detected. And look at what they're doing. It's just prime numbers, which it's amazing if you had something that was just the prime numbers, but think about this. So he goes on. I'm going to move this over just a little bit. There we go. I'm sorry, Brian, it'll probably ruin everything with the... Okay, so I know. So look at this. Because repeated observation tells us that only intelligent beings create messages, natural laws never do. When we see messages, when you receive text, when you receive things from people, you know it's coming from an intelligent source. And if that source uses language to communicate, and DNA is language, and mathematics is language, and language, like different languages is language, all of those are information-bearing codes. The only source, and I repeat, the only source that has been observed to do this is intelligence. There's no other known source. Okay? So the irony lies in the fact that Sagan was absolutely convinced that a simple string of prime numbers proves the existence of an intelligent being, but the equivalent of 1,000 encyclopedias in the first one-celled life does not. And I hope you can see the irony and the total special pleading. Special pleading is when you don't treat the other person's argument as you do your own. You give it a special position, a special place. Because anybody that you would argue with and talk about, first, only known source is intelligent, 1,000 encyclopedias. Has to be. It just has to be. Okay? So, and the cell, oh my goodness, I show a video that's done by Harvard Animation, lab in Harvard, and it just shows the inner workings of a cell. And you just can watch it. I don't usually play the sound because they're the leukocytes, then go through the semi-plastic, blah, 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 and you're like, I have no idea. Just watching it, though, you can see the complexity on a scale, that is just amazing. Somebody compared it to the cell is more complex than the city of New York. Just a single cell. It is amazing, okay? So it's interesting too, and I have this paper I can get to you. It's called Seti and Dna. And basically he says if you accept the principles of Seti, you cannot deny the intelligence behind DNA. So he basically takes the set statements of Seti and how Seti detects intelligent life and absolutely proves that if these things happened, we have encountered intelligence. He says if you use their qualifications, it proves our point. Okay? And it shows that they are denying arguments that are against their ideology, which is bias. It is unmitigated bias. We can be biased as long as we know what we believe, we can put it aside, look at the evidence, and reevaluate. It's only when you cannot reevaluate that it is dangerous. Okay? So he goes on, he says the equivalent of 20 million books inside the heads of every one of us. This is Sagan. Okay? The brain is a very big place in a very small place. Makes you think of Aladdin. Says the neurochemistry of the brain is astonishingly busy. The circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans. So we have something that is, in reality, probably the most complex assemblage of matter in the known universe, is the brain. Yet, with all our intelligence, over eons, over centuries, we can't even come close to what non-intelligence has designed. I mean, think about it. Not to be, but sometimes I think we throw common sense out the window in the base of ideologies. This is apparent. This is something that I really don't think you have to be convinced of. But what happens is you have enough people that we look up to that are the new high priests and scientists, and we start doing this. I don't understand, but it must just be that deep that I can't understand it. No, you can't understand it because it's incomprehensible, because it makes no sense. So a lot of the times we associate and we get into a certain degree of idol worship and we allow that to cloud our vision. God has given us good minds to be able to think. Okay? So he is claiming that this is better. So non-intelligence has created something greater than all of our greatest minds can create. Okay? So he goes on. So Sagan, they say, probably underestimates. Okay? But using his numbers, here's Madison Square Gardens. Okay, I'd prefer. It's not McNichol anymore. What is it, Mile High? No. Where the Nuggets play? Ball Arena.
Yes.
I'm a Nugget fan. Ball Arena. Okay. But anyways, so there's 20,000 seats that we have. And so we're comparing this to the brain. Okay? So first, the amount of space. Then what we wanted to do is he said, you have 20,000 seats. So how do we get to 20 million bits of information? You would have to then put 1,000 books on every single one of the seats to get the equivalent of information that your brain is capable of holding. Just let that sink in. 1,000 books on each of the 20,000 seats. Wow, that's the amount of information bitwise that he calculated your mind had capacity for. So when we think about this, that brain, oh my gosh, is so amazing. That's how much specified complexity is within now the functionality. This develops, think about this. This develops also from a single fertilized egg. This is just one of the systems. So when we talk about the modifications and everything that evolution has to do, it also has to be in the developmental process. I sometimes think we don't know how complex it is. We look at the end form. We look at the body as it is now. But it wasn't always that way, obviously. Starting with a single cell, everything developed from one type of cell. The DNA in your system told which cells to become what cells, when to develop. Think about at the time of birth, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a hole in your heart that closes the minute you're born because you are changing how you're interacting, and your lungs now go from breathing water to breathing air. Okay? These are just some of them, and I'm trying to remember back, we had a doctor give a presentation years ago on the amazing things that happened at the moment of birth. But the whole process, if any one thing goes wrong, it's death. So I think sometimes we have oversimplified everything. We see the end product and go, yeah, you got all these things. But it had to develop, and it developed with no one instructing it. It was all built in to the coded information, that specified complexity in your body.
Yeah. Just to give you an idea, like how complex and fast the brain is, you could take bull riding, or I watch motocross, and when they jump, sometimes they have to maneuver in the air.
Right.
And they do that by twisting their body, twisting the throttle, hitting the brake. But they do that to keep from colliding. And those calculations, you don't train for that. You know, it's not like, oh, I remember how to move so high. It's instantaneous.
Yep.
It's like your brain saw it, and your hands and your feet responded to it.
Yeah.
Same way with a bull rider, or,
Yep.
you know, he's feeling like, oh, I'm not touching anything anymore. And, you know,
yeah.
but it's
Split second. Well, we're going to get to that. That's a great segue. And there's also one of the fascinating creatures that I discovered just in the last couple of years is called the slingshot spider, and it's in places like Peru. It is like a millimeter in length. What it does is it pulls itself back on its web. It locks itself in place, and then it calculates things moving. It launches itself faster than any astronaut could handle the G's, and it hits its target. I mean, amazing things like that we see in nature. We see like different fish, the spitting fish that has to calculate, because when you look underwater and you look in the air, the diffraction is different. So they have to know how to calculate that diffraction, But there was an experiment that was done, and this is fascinating. If intelligent human beings can't create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent laws to do so? So a Japanese firm decided how many computers would it take to process what the brain processes in 1 second. 82,944 processors.
but that would have to be
That's how much hard space and silicon chips, processors you would need to do what your brain does in 1 second. And it does it coolly. It doesn't generate the amount of heat that this generates. You guys, we have just lost how complex the world really is. And that's why Paul says that anybody, God has not left himself without witness. If you look at the heavens and you look at the world around you, there are no excuses if you think about it. There's no neglecting that intensity, okay? So before talking about new life forms, remember the most difficult problem for Darwinists. You got to get life. So it's kind of like, you know, it all starts, this is down here would be called the Luca, the last universal common ancestor. They have to come up with absolutely everything. Everything living has to be explained by this evolution, okay? But when we think about it, they can't get. Everything we know, experimentally that we know, life only comes from life. Okay? And even when they create in the lab, or we have aliens doing it, but then again, that just puts back the origin a little farther. It doesn't solve the problem. Okay? So if Darwinists don't have an explanation for the first life, then what's the point of speaking about new life forms? The process of macroevolution, if it's possible at all, can't even begin unless there's pre-existing life. I like to say it this way, they can't even get on the playing field. They can't even start. But yet they want us to say that, okay, we have the hardware. We don't know how the hardware of the computer got here. But once the computer's here, we have software now. I mean, it's very similar. Well, no, you need the scaffolding. You need everything that software, evolution, runs on. You can't just say, well, it just had to be here because we're here, and it's the only option. Because they're taking out intelligent causation, even though the whole process of SETI is looking for intelligent causation. But when it comes to anything else, again, they're very specific in what they'll allow intelligence in. We can only find aliens, higher intelligence, but we can't find God, a superintelligence. You know, why not? Okay? All right. So, against all empirical and forensic evidence, Darwinists make up just so stories, spontaneous generation, or panspermia. Again, neither have been observed. This isn't evidential science. This is analogy and ideology, okay? That magically gives them the first life they need. They don't even have an explanation for the source of the non-living chemicals, much less an explanation for life. They can't even get the chemicals. And again, we lose the complexity, okay? So if there is no God, so first they can't get on the playing field because they can't start getting life from non-life, or at least have not shown evidentially. They try to make analogies or just so stories, but why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe even here? And again, that was a prior argument that we worked on. So now really he goes into what is called macroevolution, from goo to you via the zoo. Now, I'm doing a little more talking on I don't have enough faith to be an atheist tonight because I think these points are intensely important. I think some of the other ones, even though maybe philosophically they're a little harder to comprehend, most of the areas that you will get pushback is that evolution is a fact. Evolution is true. Evolution took place. Just look around you. And we need to make sure that we're understanding a couple of points. Okay? So now we'll talk primarily about the different things that he talks about. He comes up with 5 different points in why evolution doesn't work. But we're going to hit a couple of points. First, he used, did anybody find, I had a couple of words here that I thought maybe people would need explanation on, but does anybody off the top of their head, did you guys have any difficulties with any of the words or concepts that you need me to go over? No? Okay, because I think most of the time they explain the words. Like they use the word tautology, but then they give an explanation for it. So I think most of them were explained in the text. So, okay? So, most of this, the biggest thing, do you guys remember he said, if there was one thing when it comes to the evolution process that you were to go away with, what did he say that would be? Does anybody remember? That's okay. It goes with Columbo tactics. Clarifying meanings. What were the words that you need to clarify meanings on? Do you remember? Evolution. Because they do what is called, in logic, it's called the fallacy of equivocation, where they have one word, but it has different meanings for different people. And they kind of obscure it. A lot of the times you'll get this when people say Christians or intelligent design or creationists can't do good science. Okay? They'll say that. what they're construing is the beliefs that Christians have in historical science makes it so they can't do operational science, the way we get our iPhones. So we can say, no, they have differing, they kind of pound that all into one word, science. Evolution is science. Well, no, evolution is historical science that is done forensically. Operational science, how we get our iPhones and how we get the internet and all those things, that's experimental science. That's repeatable. Doesn't matter what you believe about the past to be able to do good experimental science. But what they do is they throw that out there and people think, oh, well, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah.
You know, they're a little off their base, so they probably can do good science. No, you've just misunderstood or they've changed the meaning of the word. Evolution is the same. And this is really sad, and I've had this experience where I've had people get frustrated with me saying, you creationists, you want to separate it into micro and macro. The reason being is because remember we talked that you cannot prove something by analogy. You need to prove it by evidence. Analogy is used to help you explain or to understand when you're having difficulty grasping the concepts. If they make evolution just one word, then micro and macro are the same thing, and microevolution happens. And now they can say that is evidence for macro because they have conflated the two words. Is that making sense? So microevolution, we would call variation within kind. And it's interesting because when they do research, variation within kind is a conservative function. It's not a creative function. And what I mean by that is usually the natural selection kills those who have become mutated beyond what's healthy, and they die off. It usually is a conserving thing that keeps the best qualities. Give you an example. If you had a bunch of dogs that were not being bred with the exact same breed of dogs, you actually get a lot of the times healthier dogs. Because what happens is you can isolate mutations within breeds because you have so inbred them that you actually cause certain point mutations to become permanent. And it is very detrimental. Bulldogs, without the help of humans, I don't even think they'd be birthed. Because aren't all bulldogs, don't they have to be cesarean? I'll have to check on that. I'm pretty sure that bulldogs, the birthing process, I think most of them, if not all of them, would be not surviving because of the genetics. So that's beside the point. I'll look that up and I'll get more information back to you. But it keeps the kind healthy by weeding out those who have mutations that could hurt the population as a whole. It doesn't create new things and then keep pushing them beyond those limits. And we'll get into some of those different 5 areas when we go through that. Is that making sense to everybody? Is everybody with me? Okay? Okay. So the micro and macro, okay? We need to remember that even though they use selection, which inherently means intelligence because you're choosing, nature doesn't select in that sense. There's no intelligence, according to their theory. It is blind. There is no end goal in mind. There is no, ooh, if I make this change and this change and this change, eventually down the road I'll get this. There's none of that going on. And I think sometimes because of the choice of words, we naturally bring in the connotations or the emotional aspect. When we think of selection, we think of intelligence. So we've smuggled in at least this idea of a possibility because selection can occur. But we're, I think, to a certain degree imposing that intelligence aspect, which bolsters their point, but it's not there. There is no intelligence. There is no foreknowledge. There is no seeing. It is purely a blind process. That's why atheists like John Gray said this whole idea of progression is a myth if evolution is true. There is no progression. There's no better. There's no worse. There's no going towards a goal. There just is. And so we have these value-laden statements. Okay, so we go and so be he, this is interesting, and it doesn't go into this in this book. This was a recent book of his. But he did studies to find out if there were any beneficial mutations. And basically he said all mutations are a degradation of the organism's fitness, and thus all mutations are detrimental even if they provide momentary advantage. They're all downhill. Even if you get a mutation that for a short period of time, like sickle cell anemia, if you're over in India and you won't get malaria, but you're going to die by the time you're 35 anyways. You know, it is always a degradation. So we truly, I think, can say all mutations are detrimental. Even if they pose a momentary improvement. Give you the idea with bacteria. Those bacteria, if they take a culture and they put in antibiotic and you get the antibiotic resistant bacteria, as soon as you put that population back into general population, they usually die off. They're not healthy. They actually can't absorb certain things. It's a downward path. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, so what we're going to do is, why don't we take a quick break? You can get kind of move around a little bit, and then we will just list the 5 things why can't natural selection do the job that supposedly creates all these magnificent things around us. Yeah.
Mutations don't produce more mutations, do they? They don't reproduce.
Oh yeah, they do. We all have mutations. There was actually, they were worried about, they were looking at, and this would be population geneticists, they were looking at if we passed on so many, and the numbers coming to my head is like 5, if like each parent handed down 5 mutations to their kids, then we would be going, we would not be able to stop the downward slide into extinction because of unfitness. When they actually could look at genetics, and remember there are millions and millions of huge DNA code, but they're showing that parents, each parent probably passes 100 to 200 mutations. Most of those can't be weeded out. And so we as a species are going extinct. There's a whole book written on it, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome by Dr. John Sanford. We should be extinct thousands of times over if humans have been on the earth as long as evolutionists want to say. Yeah.
Well, you remember in the Bible where for a while you could marry your sister, your brother,
Right.
your cousin.
Right.
And because the bloodline was still pure, but as it got more and more
Mutated.
or polluted, God said, no more first cousin, no more,
Yep.
find
Right.
somebody else.
Yes, you had to be so far separated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's probably coming full circle where, we have these mutations, but because people keep choosing other ethnic groups to join with, maybe some of that is.
No, that's the conservative nature of natural selection, in the sense that, yeah, if you married someone, that's why we have in certain cultures where there was a lot of, because of social or racial or whatever you want to call it, the Egyptian monarchies or the ruling classes, they would take brothers and sisters or close relatives, and you actually have certain effects of that. The sloping of a lot of the foreheads was a detriment. You have it in other tribes and other things around the world. So yeah, what happens is if you marry a close relative, the likelihood that you and your sister both got the same mutation for a certain disease is a lot higher. And now you have children with that close relative, now your children only have the one. So they have it. It's now in their germline, and it's passed on. What can happen then is, say you have that point mutation from your mom, but your dad, doesn't have it, but then you marry someone outside your family, maybe you can get rid of that depending on how they recombine for your kids. So yeah, so it is definitely one race. We are one people. So why don't we take a quick minute or a quick break, and then we can come back and we will finish this part up and then go on to tactics.
Guess when I was talking about mutations, I had in mind a really big word mutation. That a lot like two heads, you know.
Yeah. No, most of the mutations are very minor, and they start accumulating. That's what he calls genetic entropy, meaning the buildup of mutations that nature doesn't even know are there because they're not expressed in your outward body form. Okay? And so these build up to the point that the organism just is unfit, can't survive. You get diseases, you get other things.
So that's going according to natural law. We don't improve, we get.
Everything we can look at observational wise shows everything in decline. Very similar to the second law of thermodynamics. Everything is going to disorder. So they even, in the sense of what we see in life, is the opposite. We see things going extinct. We don't see things coming into new forms. So really, all the scientific evidence is really against them.
We'll say like corn in Iowa, all the fantastic yield increases is mostly due to the seed, you know, in spite of farming practices.
Right. It's intelligent manipulation of the plant genetics. That's why, you know, they go through with the book that they really are using an improper form of laboratory research. Because if they ever do come up with life from non-life, it was done intelligently. So I mean, they really are showing that, you know, if they really want to experiment, yeah, get the chemicals you think maybe did it, throw them in a room, see what happens over it. You see the problem. They're using intelligence to prove non-intelligence. It doesn't quite work that way.
Do you think the majority of scientists, though, are beyond that? They probably can see that point, but
I think he gets into it in the end part of the chapter, which we won't go over with some of his objections. One of the objections that he gives at the end is that he truly believes most of these scientists are thinking that it's been proven. But most of the time they've become so super isolated in studying like one aspect of maybe one creature, like the cilia on a bacteria or something like that, that they always think, or there's a preponderance to think that somebody else has shown the proof in their area of biology. So it's a lot of it is, I think that it's been said so long. It's been also, there's other things. There's financial loss. There's loss of credibility. There's loss, you know, and even Richard Dawkins in one of his books writes about a creation scientist that he thinks is just a tragic thing because he got his PhD under Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard, but he was a creationist. And so Richard Dawkins just bemoans this idea that this guy threw his career away because of his stupid religion and beliefs. Dawkins doesn't address why he's a creationist. But, you know, those are those things. So you lose. There's also a lot of pride in it. You know, there's just a whole bunch of stuff. But I think most of them truly have been taught that. They think it's true. They've been told enough, long enough, loud enough, you know, that they're convinced. They don't necessarily see it in their field. They think maybe somebody else has proved it somewhere else. Oh, the geologists have proved it. Oh, the astrophysicists have proved it. Oh, the cell biologists have proved it. Or the, you know, whatever. Well, we will start again. And again, we're just going to quickly go over the 5 mechanisms. He goes into much more detail in your book. So, you know, it's dense. It's dense. There's a lot of information. There's also a lot of stuff that, you know, you get. This kind of reminds me of, I think I'd talked to you about the one kiddo that a kiddo I'd worked with. And when I left him, in high school, we had gone through a lot of this, and I've done this with several kids, but we went through this, went to college, never read another creation book, and became somewhat convinced that evolution was true. And so one of the questions that I asked this individual is, well, did you read the contrary study? Did you keep up with? And no. One thing I want to remind everybody is that this is not the end of learning, the beginning of learning. There's always deeper to go. And as you mature in certain areas, and you don't have to figure out every argument for the existence of God, but as you gain knowledge in areas that you enjoy, like I love science, philosophy, keep digging, because there are objections to some of these that as you mature, then you can grasp better and understand why those objections don't work, maybe more research. So don't ever think that this is the end all. These are beginnings of studies that take you deeper and deeper into understanding and knowing, this is a theistic universe, I believe. So, all right. So the first one he talks about is genetic limits, okay? We seem to be built into basic types, kinds that can't be breached. And we know this from breeders. Now, when we look at dogs, we have an immense amount of dogs, but you're never going to get a cat. We never have got a cat. You haven't got some of these. And they're actually trying in labs now to do what are called chimeras, which is based on the Greek, where they have like satyrs, and they have different things that are half human, half horse, or half. It's supposed to be illegal, at least when it comes to humans. But that doesn't say much. Just being illegal doesn't seem to carry a lot. But the thing that we need to do is also, he gives a great, there's some good tables in the text that goes through the differences between intelligent design and non-intelligent design. Those are great areas to look over. We're not going to go over, but great areas to look over. And it's interesting because he gives this idea in the book. He talks about his debate with an individual, talks about a Boeing 747, and the naturalistic guy took up on his thing and says, yeah, evolution is like the evolution of planes. And he kept trying to remind the gentleman that those were all done by intelligence. You may want to get a different analogy because you're proving my point, not yours. No, I think it's good. No, but you see these sequential changes. Yes, but all those sequential changes were intelligently devised after experimentation. It wasn't non-intelligence that had no idea of the future, okay? So he really goes into that, okay? So even with intelligence, we have limits. But we're supposed to believe that non-intelligence has broken those limits? Do you see the paradox and the problem? Our brilliant minds can't do it, but non-intelligence can? How does that work? Can you explain to me how that process works? Again, put them on the hot seat, okay? So genetic limits, we see this all over, okay? The next one he talks about is cyclical change. And this is where, I like the little quip he gives, and I'm not sure if this is where I first heard it, but he says natural selection helps explain survival of the species, but not arrival of the species. Again, it's a preserving. When we do research and we do studies into what natural selection does, it's for the conservation of the species in a healthy place. It gets rid of the mutations because of the fall, and it maintains a healthy balance. That's what it does. It is not a creative force. It's a destructive force or a conservative force, okay? So it is survival, but not arrival. So there's no directional development towards new forms. It's just a back and forth dance. And this is where we get the survival and not the arrival. He gives the example in the book about the finches on the islands, on the Galapagos. Depending on the weather conditions, the beak sizes would change so that they could eat either harder shelled nuts or not so hard shelled nuts. And it's interesting, there's some studies that ICR has done that shows that this is actually an epigenetic change, that there's like a biofeedback loop that the birds detect the change in the conditions, and they actually can turn on and off genes so that their offspring have bigger beaks or smaller beaks or whatever. It is so amazing. So that's where it's more conservative because it's adapting to the situations around. I know that Dave, they were just talking about because of the amount of elephants that have been killed, they're finding out that the elephants that, I guess some of the female elephants will produce tusks, but they're also getting killed. So they're finding out that the most fertile elephants are the ones that are non-tusk-bearing females, which are the ones that are surviving. So there are adaptions that God has built into the genetic code that this epigenetics can turn on and off. We don't know how, but are actually able. We see it in parrotfish populations. Parrotfish populations can change sex. And so if they get out of a certain percentage, and I can't remember if it's males to females or females to males, one or the other. Yeah, no. But what they do is then some of them will turn into the opposite sex so that they can bring in the population again. But they don't become anything else. They're still parrotfish. But God has built into an adaptive process that is conservative, that helps preserve the species as the world changes, but not create new things. Number 3, irreducible complexity. Okay, this is something that was really coined by Michael Behe, and it goes into the definition. It gives the definition on page 144, so if you want to look at that. But I love what Darwin said, and we hear this in many different places. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So if irreducible complexity is true, it totally destroys the theory. So again, we see multiple problems. Even if we give them life from non-life, they still can't get to us. They can't get to complex species. Okay, we know of many things that fit that description. Okay, cells, blood clotting systems, vision, cilia, or the motor on a lot of small single cell organisms. Okay, so we see this. Okay. He goes in, and I like what Behe says. The idea of Darwinian molecular evolution is not based on science. Clearly, it's not based on what we see. Okay? So many people have tried to critique irreducible complexity, and the best example of this that he gives is a mousetrap. That on the traditional mousetrap, it usually you have 5 parts. Take away any of those parts, you're no longer going to kill mice. It's non-functioning. Now, others have come along and said, well, I can come up with a mousetrap that has only 3. Well, still, it shows that you intelligently designed something to reduce, but it's still, you couldn't get from the mousetrap with the 5 parts to the one with 3 in small modifications that would be functional through the time. So we see, but also, that's not the point. And second of all, biologic systems are much more complex than a mousetrap. It's just used as an analogy to help you understand the complexity that even as something as simple as a mousetrap, 5 parts, that's all it has, 5 parts. One of them being gone, you have nothing. You have just parts. You don't have a functioning mousetrap. Yes, Randy?
This is a question.
Yeah.
Or a statement and question. So God gives a geographical location where life began, the Garden of Eden.
Right.
Describe the rivers that flew out.
Okay.
Does Darwin give a geographical location where all of this was supposed to have taken place?
Well, there's for that part, no, because Darwin only deals with once you start. Again, most of these evolutionists, it's only once you have self-replicating life. So they have ideas of possibly what it could be. Now, when it comes to human evolution, you know, there's two major theories, but no, they can't specify. And even with us as creationists, because of the flood, we couldn't specify a Garden of Eden anymore because of things that have happened. So they don't though. Yes. Well, and we can talk about that at another time. So when what Behe says as well is that he says there is currently no experimental evidence to show that natural selection can get around irreducible complexity. Okay? And he's put his stuff out there to be critiqued, and he's answered his. So this is an area, we're just touching the surface. Okay? Number 4, he gives non-viability of transitional forms. He gives the quick example of what a feather does, what scales do, and the in-between forms are going to do absolutely nothing. They'll hinder the creature. So you can look at different half wings, half leg, you know, all these different things, because remember, it has to be little by little change. And actually, Michael Behe did a study, and it's called I think it's in The Edge of Evolution. But he basically states that how many mutations can happen at once before it is fatal to the organism in certain areas. And this is 30,000 foot overview. Again, you could read the book. But he's saying really 2 or 3, and you start in a single aspect of you know, in one formation, 2 or 3, and it becomes fatal to the organism in that sense. Now, we're talking about not mutations over the entire DNA. We're talking about those that are within the area of saying the functioning of the cilia turning. So if 3 mutations happened within the DNA code that forms the cilial motor, that thing would be dead in the water. It wouldn't function. Okay? Yes, Dean.
I always liked the woodpecker. I always wondered how many headaches he had before he got it right.
Oh, they're amazing. Yeah. It would not be, or a lot of speakers will use the bombardier beetle. You know, he'd blow himself up. You know, how do you learn from that when you're dead? You know, adaptions like that. Oh, yeah. So, and then he does molecular isolation. This is an area that I am not real well versed in. There's also an area of study that I know Dave has looked into called what they call orphan genes. I don't know if they're the same. They're a set of genetic coding that is very specific to certain kinds, we would call them. They're not there's no evolutionary tie, they're just very distinct. What he talks about with molecular isolation is that there are ways that the body produces the proteins that it needs, and that there is no evolutionary change between any species. So really, we're all as far from each other as we are close. They said, you know, if you look at the line of evolution that puts like fish in between, or amphibians, you know, you go fish and then amphibians and then reptiles and all this, said if you take any of those stages in between, there is molecular isolated in the production of certain proteins that they're as far away from a turkey as they are from an amphibian. Or, so even those things that seem to be closely related because of homology are actually just as far because of these molecular gaps or these isolation. So that's an area that I need to do more research in, because I'm not as familiar with that. I understand the concept generally, but again, we should be asking the question, well, what's the evidence behind it? I want to look at what they were referring to. I'd like to see some studies. And I think it's very similar to what Orphan Genes kind of serve the same thing. Okay? So, what we find are there's really no transitions, isolated in distinct groups. Then they go into the fossil record, and the fossil record does not show it. One example, Stephen Jay Gould came up with an entire idea of how it happens and not caught in the fossil record because the fossil record doesn't show what Darwinism needs. Okay? So that was called punctuated equilibrium. Okay? So it goes in, we're not going to go into, is ID an option? Yes, it is, or intelligent design and creation. First, remember there are only two types of causes: natural or non-intelligent, and intelligent for every event and cause we have. They want to say that you can't have intelligent causes in regards to biology, which is really, they're just ruling things out because they don't like them beforehand. They're not following the evidence. Also, intelligent design makes positive arguments. It can be falsified. Okay, if some mechanism comes around someday, you can falsify it. Evolution really is unfalsifiable. Okay, so it is something that can be researched, and it's not coming from religion as we talked about earlier. It is compatible with religion. It says the same thing that we read in Genesis, but we have not come to these conclusions because of Genesis. We can look at the evidence. Okay, so that really kind of, I'm not going to go over the other things unless there are specific questions on that chapter. Yeah.
On fossils, haven't they found, what would I say, live matter maybe in the bones? DNA? Bones that should be, bones that should be according to evolutionists,
Oh, you talking about unfossilized bones? Soft tissues that they found in fossils? Yes, yes. There's a great project that was done by a fraternity of scientists. They came out, it was called the Idyno Project. And so they did a lot of evaluation. I can give you information on that. Yeah. We have, I think there are 14 biomolecules that they have detected, even partially, some DNA, but, traces. And I mean, some of the pictures are just amazing. But we actually give a whole talk on that. But yes, there are things that are causing some major problems with this idea of fossilization and how old these things are. Yep. Okay. So really a good takeaway from all of this too is information only comes from one source, and that is intelligence. Yes.
Is the genetic incompatibility, is there an aspect of genetic incompatibility or genetic limitation that has to do with the incompatibility of different kinds?
I think there's that limit. I think there is also a limit within kinds that have mutated to a point where they can no longer have viable offspring. So I think as the genome degrades, I think even things that in the past could reproduce. Give you an example. On different Galapagos Islands, they have different groups of finches. Well, the finches on this side of the island, the farthest, like over here, can't reproduce and have fertile offspring. But this one can reproduce with this one can reproduce with this one can reproduce with this one. So there's a spectrum. But the ones on the end seem, for comparative purposes, to gone beyond a point in their genetic mutations that it's always detrimental to offspring. It always kills them. So, but yes, and definitely when it comes between species, yeah. Did that answer your question, Dave? Okay.
And one thing to kind of go along with that too is like the finches on the Galapagos. It's like they talk about the changes of the finches, and Darwin used that.
Right.
But what was it? Of the types of finches they have, they're worried about them commingling again and kind of going down.
Yes.
And mixing, and becoming mutts, I guess, of finches, because you'll lose this specific species.
Yes.
But
That's the conservative power of natural
it's
selection.
actually, they'll be healthier
Right.
when they go back to, the same species, the same.
Right. One of the books we're going to get into is Jerry Coyne, who is a biologist at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that he gives in why evolution is true, to have a new species, you have to have a geographic relocation of those new adapted kinds. Because what happens is exactly what he's saying. If they remingle with the general population, those mutations will go away because it's a conservative process. And so you have to have either islands go up or disaster happen. There has to be a separation. Otherwise, you don't get those specific characteristics of if you want to call it a subspecies, because they become mutts, which is healthier. And it actually, so it's interesting. Okay, so there we go. So is that, any other questions on that one? Yes?
This isn't a question, but just a comment where he says, where you have changes in the, like you have apes and people and the common bones and this and that. They say that it's not so much that it's because one evolved from the other, but because they both had to live on the same planet, basically.
Right.
And you think, whoa, that's pretty simple.
Well, it's one of those that cuts both ways. If you have a possibility, or if you have two different theories or ideas, and something could be proof for both of them, it really is useless in that sense. So what they were saying in the book is, they say this is common ancestor, but it could also be common design to live in the same biosphere, to be able to have a food triangle, to be able to do all that. They would have to process certain things certain ways. So it's very similar to the argument that atheists will give for God, saying you just believe in God because you need a crutch. Well, that cuts both ways. You don't believe in God because you want to live the life you want to live. So if we're saying that you're saying I believe in God because of a personal desire, it's same for you. So really it proves nothing. So let's move on to something else. And so a lot of the times I will use that and I'll say, hey, if an explanation both have the same, then we need to move on to something that proves one or the other, not that can be used for proof for both. Okay? So tactics. So really chapters 8 and 9, 8 was perfecting Columbo, giving you ideas on how to practice. So again, tactics is more methodology. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and some of the other books that we're going to do is more giving you informational content. It's also giving you ways to argue, so we're delving a little bit into logic and rhetoric. Okay, not formally, but kind of on the side. But tactics is truly, I think, an astounding book that helps you with methodology. How do you present your arguments? How do you use questions? I really think asking questions, and we see it in Scripture. We talked about this. Christ asked a lot of questions, okay, to get to the heart of a matter. Why do you ask me what is good? Why do you call me good? He turns it back on them. So he really goes into ways to improve your skill. Okay? He says that we've spent so much time on Columbo because it's central to everything else that we're going to do. If you know how to use the 3 Columbo tactics, okay? Question 1, for clarification. Question 2, burden of proof. Question 3, leading questions. Then you really can navigate. But like basketball or baseball, go Braves, or baseball, you have to practice. So he really in this chapter just gives you ways of practicing. So he says basically there are ways to improve your skills. 3 areas. First, anticipate what may come up. So think of questions, think of what they may be presenting. If you're going in to talk to a science class about human evolution, probably going to ask you a lot of questions about human evolution. So anticipate the questions, or if it's a debate, things, or just what your friends' questions are. Maybe you've heard them stated in the past. oh, the Bible's been written by so many people over so many years. It's flawed. It's this, that, and the other. Well, maybe you should think of questions around that. Okay? Number 2, reflect afterward. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay? Not a spaghetti western either. I know. You've got to reflect. You guys, you're going to make mistakes. You're always going to make mistakes. Learn from them. Hopefully they're done in a gracious way that, you don't burn bridges. So we should always seasoned with salt, so make sure. So you're going to make mistakes. Practice your responses in reflective moments. Think about it. And he gives several different things. He says watching debates can be helpful. You can stop it. He talks about radio programs where he'll listen to somebody for the first 3 questions and then he'll turn it down as if he needs to respond to those. How would he respond? I do this in my head. I don't do it out loud because people would probably think it was quite rude, but I listen to conversations at other tables. Sometimes it's hard not to. Okay. I'm not, but you hear people talking behind you and all of a sudden you're keyed in and you're like, oh, well, how would I respond to that? What would I do? Along those lines. Remember, when you analyze how your interaction went with somebody, remember the ambassador's model, and he really touches on that in the beginning of the book. You need information. You need knowledge. Second of all, wisdom. How well do you deploy that information? How do you use it? And the third one is character. Are you a grumpy, mean person? Do you show kindness? How that is. So when you interact, say, did I treat him with respect even if I disagreed with him? That leads into the character question. Did I ask the right questions? Did I use Columbo 3 leading questions correctly? That's wisdom. Did I know what the heck I was talking about? Question number 1, do I need to enhance my area of understanding in that area because I had no idea? But remember, even if you have no idea, you can always ask questions. Okay? So questions are always good. Okay? We need to, think of counter arguments, things of that nature. Learn from your mistakes. Practice out loud. Get a friend if you can to do it. This helps us not to be caught by surprise by any questions. You've already thought about it. He even goes into the point where he says, sometimes I feel like people look at me and they think, oh, he's so spontaneous. He says, nah, I've practiced it. I know exactly what they're going to say. And, it may come out in different sequences, but I've thought about that question. I've evaluated responses. So, and there's many different ways to answer things. So the more and more you do it, also, what did he say happens to your confidence? It goes up. You feel more adept. You feel more in control of the situation. Okay? He also, and I think this is very important, more from a relational standpoint, but also from a persuasive standpoint, is go out of your way to establish common ground with the individual. Find things that you have in common. You become relatable. You can talk about things maybe other than spiritual and religious, but when you find common ground, it shows the unity. And people really thrive on that. The anxiety levels and the depression levels are because of broken relationships all over the place. So relate to people. Get to that common ground. Okay? So he goes through, we won't go through all, but he also says, and this is going into, he says there are 2 styles of Columbo. One is the one that you use to persuade, which is, the stumbling around kind of, gracious, let me ask you a couple of questions, you're generous in that. He said, but there is the the use that a lawyer would use it for, and that is for refuting. So say you're in a debate. Are you going to change probably the debater's mind that you're debating against? Probably not. So who are you trying to persuade?
The judge.
Well, the judge, or if it's a school debate, who are you trying to? The audience. They're not on the spot, they're listening. So in this, you may take more of an aggressive approach, still being cautious and complimentary in that, but to refute their argument. So you would use Columbo in a way to show that their arguments fail, okay? You're persuading those who are listening to the argument. So there's different ways. Most of the time we're going to be doing friend to friend. I don't know many of us are going to be doing formal debates, but it's on those, and you may have situations, okay? So he goes into that. Now the last one he goes through is, what if somebody starts using Columbo on you? Now, how should we be using Columbo? What are we really trying to do with Columbo?
Get them to answer or get them to think about their position.
Okay, think about, what are we ultimately trying to get to with all of our questions? What do you mean by that? What's your evidence? What are we getting at?
The stone in the shoe.
Well, we want to plant a stone, but what's the big word? The truth. Good job. We want the truth. But a lot of the times, people use the Columbo tactic ingenuously. They don't care about truth. The example he gives in the book is Peter Boghossian. Peter Boghossian, who is a philosopher, will actually use logical fallacies that he knows are horrible arguments, but they confuse. They cause people to doubt. And so he's not after truth. He's after the response of doubt. And so he goes in and he says, how do you react to these tactics by atheists? And you can get Boghossian's book. It's called Manual for Creating Atheists. He was at Portland University, or University of Portland, but he has recently left because, which I totally agree with him, this is where we can find common ground. It has become an ideological just zone where you can't contradict anything that you're being taught. And he says free thought is gone. This isn't the discourse of ideas. You can actually get his resignation letter online. So here's something I agree with him. Yeah, we should be able to talk and discuss. And I'd like to talk about your tactics. And you'll find them. They're called street epistemologists. And they follow his ideas to deconvert people. But they do it in ways that isn't trying to find the truth. They use questions, and a lot of the times they use the what if questions. They're just trying to cause you doubt, not actually bring you to illumination or to clear thinking, okay? So he said, because a lot of the times, they'll try to get you to answer a question. He has two challenges. He said one is called Chopra's challenge, Deepak Chopra. And he said, they'll try to trap you with their questions. They'll have you answer a question, but they know it's politically incorrect, so you will already get the ire of the people listening. So now you've lost status when it comes to your character. Now you seem to be a bigoted so-and-so, okay? And it's easily misunderstood. We need to be careful when people use questions that are leading us to confusion or to cause degradation of who the person is, and again, distract us from the ideas. So what do? You ask questions. I'm not sure if I quite understand where you're going with that. Do you want to state it more plainly? I'm not sure what your question's getting at. Other ways, and he gives multiple ways in the book, okay? With the atheists question, because that's the other, so the Chopra's challenge was when they're trying to discredit you by leading questions. Either questions or answers that are going to be misunderstood, or they're going to put you in a negative light. So you lose that persuasive power that's needed to persuade or to have people recognize what you're saying is true. Okay? If you feel that they're on this track, stop and clarify. Remember, you are in control 100% of your side of the conversation. You don't have to go anywhere you don't. Don't speak too quickly. I have students all the time that do this. I had one kid that, his name was Shane. I love the kid to death. I think he's still doing well. But my idea was the first thing out of Shane's mouth was usually the wrong answer. And sometimes the first 4 things out of Shane's mouth was the wrong answer. And you'd say, Shane, think. Oh, yeah. But he would just throw it out there immediately. And we do that a lot of the times. Kind of like our pastor's son, Sean. We were out in California, and we were doing a worldview trip. And one of the gentlemen, Brett, who asked the group, says, who's your favorite fictional character? And immediately, the son of our pastor said, Jesus. And of course, he didn't think about it, because afterwards he thought about it and goes, oh, that's not fictional. Think before you speak. Okay? So don't be afraid to say, I'm not sure where you're going with that, even if you do know where they're going with it. I'm not sure what exactly, can you spell it out a little more clearly? Then they're going to state what they believe, and then you can use the questions. You can change the burden on them. Okay? See if there's any other things that I picked out. Oh, the last thing he talks about. And he also says, never be afraid to say, let me give it some thought. We don't want to give false answers. We don't have all the answers. So think about it. But also when a question is not a question, it's a challenge in disguise. And he goes on and he says, this is what happened when someone says, what gives you the right to say every religion is wrong? Is that really a question? Are they asking me what my authority is? Am I educated in that area? Do I carry some expertise? Are they really asking a question? No. They're making a statement to discredit you, to stop the conversation. Okay? Simply, he says, simply point out that the question's confusing. Okay? When you do that, just say, what do you mean by that? Are you asking me, you know, if there's some kind of an authority, or you can parse it whatever it may be, okay? Then use questions, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, to point out. He gives one example when they said there's no, all religions say the same thing. So again, he used questions. He says, well, let me ask you this. Either Jesus was the Messiah or he was not the Messiah. It's one or the other. Is that correct? Yes. Well then, what would you say if Jesus was the Messiah? What does that, as long as there's a little understanding, it can give more meaning, he does in the book, but what does that mean for Christians if Jesus is not the Messiah? They're wrong. And Jews are right, because Jesus was not. So you start giving them, asking them questions, helping them to understand they really don't believe what they just said. You know, and help them with that, okay? And he ends that. So at the very end, he just says, when in a tough spot, always ask a question, which I think is very wise. Yes?
Years ago, we had Mormon missionaries that stopped all the time. And our church had, and we lost it, but 25 questions that you can ask Mormons. So we gave that sheet to them, and they said, well, we're going to have to see our bishop on this. And then, of course, we've never seen him again. And we think we got redlined for about 10, 15 years. They never stopped again.
Right.
No, and in those things, I think sometimes the better, and it usually doesn't last very long, but I think like the open confrontation with something like that would probably put you on a blacklist. But I think inviting them in and gently starting to uncover some things is probably a better approach.
Well, we did that too. Kathy had
Oh, yeah.
chicken dinner.
Well, we had one that came for a while when we were at a different location, and they came, what, like 3 or 4 times? That those Mormon missionaries?
Maybe half a dozen times.
Yeah, and so we were able to plant, you know, shoes. Oh, am I?
My Zoom messed up, I think.
Oh,
this is still
okay.
working.
But it's planting a rock in a shoe, because at least you had more time. But if you do almost like a full frontal assault and say, boom, here's 25 questions you can't answer, They're going to take it to their bishop. Their bishop's usually going to look at it and say, we can answer it. Throw it away. Go on. And again, there's a lot of information you're going to have to go over. Even when I think I've read, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, I've probably read it 15 to 20 times. Every time I pick out something that is nuanced. It's just the way we are. Rote repetition is very good. And there are times that I've read things that, I'm like, dude, I get it now. First 3 times I read it, I had no clue what it meant. And we build upon that knowledge. Okay? So please don't be discouraged. Don't feel overwhelmed. Again, if you've learned anything, you've grown. And we need to just be thankful. And the thing that's really great is we're going to grow forever. There's no end to our growing in knowledge and in information. What a glorious thing. So every day, God is just moving you step by step. Okay? So next week, we will be on the moral argument. So that's chapter 7. Okay? So the moral argument, chapter 7. We will be going on to we did 8 and 9 this week. We'll be going on to chapter 10, which is a whole new section in tactics. And then we will be through John 13. So John 7 through 13. So just one chapter a night. Okay? The moral argument, I think, resonates with more people because it's something that we know from that God-given conscience we have as well. But it's one of my favorite arguments. I will give the focus point next week on what's called the characteristics of morality. Okay? So we may not go into, we'll primarily hopefully just answer questions over chapter 6, maybe a few high points, but we won't go too in depth. And then chapter 7, yep. And then we'll complement it with this characteristics of morality, which is somewhat covered in the book as well. I will also come up with a new survey form that deals with just moral questions. Okay? So we'll have that. Any questions? Nope. Why don't we end with a quick prayer? See, I'm getting you out here early. And it's not because there's a baseball game on tonight. Yeah, Brian paid me earlier.
An apple pie.
An apple pie, yep. All right. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I am so grateful for fellow believers that I think about Paul's letter to the Philippians. Lord, it's so good to have co-combatants, those who we can encourage one another, we can grow with one another. Lord, I just pray that you would cause the fellowship that's growing here to continue to grow. That, Lord, we can be supports and helps for each other in those areas that you've gifted each and every one of us. Lord, I pray that you would give us opportunity, that we would be able to reach out to those around us, to loved ones, and even the occasional person we have no idea that you put in our way. Lord, I just pray that you would give us the confidence, that you would increase our faith and help us as we just want to know more and more of you. So Lord, we thank you. I pray that you would be with everybody this week in their struggles and their difficulties. And Lord, until we meet again. So Lord, we thank you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.